Hasan said, I'm going to present you some data on priming prosody structure in production, and specifically I'm going to present you some preliminary data on the first project of my PhD. And why prosody? Now, there is evidence coming from different areas showing that prosody plays a role in organizing and facilitating online language processing at different levels. However, there are still open questions on how does this happen. So what prosodic cues organize, facilitates language processing, and if it's language specific or not. To answer this question, we'll use priming, because this will allow us to isolate specific prosodic cues and more broadly to shed light on the underlying to shed light on the underlying processes and to see to what extent we have independent representation of prosodic structure. Now, our case study will be prosody in syntax. So as natural language is full of globally ambiguous sentences. This is a very famous example you're probably familiar with. Someone shot the servant of the actress who was on the balcony. Now, sentences like these have two equally plausible interpretations. We might read it with an early boundary after the first noun. Someone shot the servant of the actress who was on the balcony. Again, I cannot play the audio, sorry. In that case, the relative clause is attached to the first noun. Who is on the balcony? The servant. Or it can have a second interpretation with a late boundary after the second noun. So someone showed the servant of the actress who was on the balcony. In that case, the relative clause is I attached. Now, perception studies have shown that it's actually possible to prime intonational phrase boundaries. What does it mean is that when participants are primed with an early boundary, they tend to answer a comprehension question with a low attachment. When they're an high attachment, sorry. When they're primed with a late boundary, the other way around. And this priming effect has been found to be persistent even when the primes have no lexical material, so it's just like pseudo-speech. This priming effect has been trying to replicate it in production, so can it be carried over not just to the answer to a question, but to the production of a new ambiguous sentence? A series of studies has been conducted. However, they didn't find any priming effect of intonational phrase boundary. So the researchers concluded that there is possibly no abstract representation of prosodic boundaries, and they are just the result of semantic and syntactic processing and not a facilitating effect. Now, one of the main problems with this study, that might explain the results, might be in the kind of material that has been used. Our claim is that the material was not so ambiguous, and it was actually strongly biased syntactically, boosting one interpretation over the other, and that's why prosody was not playing a role. For this reason, our main question the first question to answer was, can we actually prime intonational phrase structure in production when the saliency of prosodic cues is not reduced by syntax? Our overall hypothesis is that at that point there will be possible to see a priming effect of prosody in production as well, so an effect of boundary, and since we are replicating this experiment using another more ambiguous construction, even an effect of construction. So when there is an actual ambiguity, there is a priming effect. To test our hypothesis, the first thing we did was conducting a norming study to validate the material. So we tested the original transfer allocation sentences, sentences such as she put the money in the basket on the table, and newly created relative clauses that were created to be as balanced as possible and as ambiguous as possible with constant structure. We ran basically an acceptability task on Labex. So participants were shown with a sentence, and then they were asked to rate the plausibility of the interpretation from 1 being very implausible to 5 being very plausible. Half of the participants were shown one interpretation, the other half were shown the other interpretation. What did the results tell us? Here you can see the ratings on the y-axis, and these are the relative clauses, so the new material, and the results seem to show that indeed the sentences were ambiguous, so both the interpretations were considered equally plausible by the participants. However, when we look at the results on the original material, this is not the case. As you can see, one of the interpretations is preferred over the other that is not even rated as plausible. It can go up to 1 totally implausible. Once we confirmed that the problem was in the material they tested and our material was actually more balanced in that sense, we could run the main priming experiment. We conducted a pilot study online to test if we can prime prosodic boundaries in production. We tested 6 participants, young adult English native speakers from the same UK area. And by the way, this is the same inclusion and exclusion criteria that we used for the participants that we used in the norming study. And this study has been, the main study has been pre-registered and went into ethical approval. And obviously the material is the one that I just presented you, so transfer of location sentences and relative clauses. The task was a replication of the original studies, so participants were asked to repeat back aloud sentences that they heard or read, silently read. So basically it was the prosodic priming paradigm. This is how it works. Participants listen to a sentence, then they are asked to repeat it, then they read a new ambiguous sentence, and they're asked to repeat it. Now, the listen and repeat works as a prime, and again, I cannot show you the audios, but basically it will be in all the experimental conditions, so either late boundary or early boundary. The read and repeat, it's the actual target to see if there is a priming effect in production, so it will always be an ambiguous sentence, and obviously it's to be read, so it's always without boundaries. So the participants' production were recorded and analyzed offline. This, for instance, is the transcription of the production of one participant, the repetition of one listening sentence. She stayed with the patient of the doctor who waits for the blood results. Those of you that are more familiar with the spectrogram, maybe they can already spot that there is a pause over here. All the analyses were done by into condition, of course, and our measuring interest following the original design was the pause and word duration at the 2 critical regions. So we measured how long was patient, how long was doctor, the duration of the word per se, and the duration of the pause up to the onset of the first post-boundary word. These 2 measurements for both patient and doctor were then normalized and balanced out of the total duration of the sentence. And I'm going to show you now some preliminary results on a subset of the data. What happens, and I'm focusing more on the relative clauses because, again, it's the more balanced material. So what happens with the sentences that participants listen to, so the repetition priming effect? Here you can see on the x-axis the 2 nouns, so patient and doctor, let's say, and on the y-axis the word and pause duration as a percentage out of the total sentence duration. When participants heard a late boundary in the sentence, this is what they did. As you can see, the word and pause duration of the second noun is longer than the one of the first noun, as expected. When they heard an early boundary, maybe the difference is not quite visible, but if we compare just the word and pause duration of the early boundaries in the 2, we can see that actually the first noun is a little longer compared to what can be a control somehow. And this confirms somehow our priming effect pattern, which cannot be seen in the transfer of location, but again, it's just the material. What's more interesting is to look at what happens when participants repeat new sentences, so they read stimuli, they read material. Again, we have the 2 critical locations, the late boundary prime on the bottom and the early boundary prime on the top, and this is what happens. And you can see that there is a nice pattern that we were expecting, with participants producing longer N2s compared to N1 when there is a late boundary, and longer N1s compared to N2s when there is an early boundary, confirming somehow a priming effect. which once again, there is no priming effect pattern in the transfer allocation as expected. So what can we conclude from these preliminary data? Again, it's few data points, so there was no model to be run, but it's still like encouraging. Can international phrase structure be primed in production when the saliency of prosody is not reduced by syntax? Our preliminary data seems to confirm so, because we have actually a variation in the duration of the nouns, both when repeating and when reading a new sentence. This confirms, first of all, methodologically, that online speech data collection is reliable enough, even for Prosodic analysis, and most of all, it's promising to show that there is indeed that we can indeed prime international phrase structure when there are proper conditions in the experiment. And this allows us to proceed with the actual experiment at a greater scale that, again, that will test different languages, not just English, but even French, because it has a particular international structure that might let us see something more, and including more fine-grained analysis, again, to try to understand what is the actual prosodic use that plays a role in sentence processing. And that's all. Thank you.